All right, we're live. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Today, we're talking about mobility prepping, aka Plan B. And I'd like this to be an open discussion. So, as with all of these spaces, anybody and everybody who wants to speak is welcome to come up. Just hit a request to speak. So, today, we're talking about mobility prepping. And this is obviously a term and a concept that we borrow from the survivalism movement. People who actively prepare for potential emergencies, disruptions to social order, disasters, situations without rule of law. I being, citizenship and mobility attorney, I think there's a similar concept in the world of mobility, basically freedom of movement, being able, at least best able, to be prepared to make a quick exit from your jurisdiction, from where you reside, in the case of an absolute emergency, right? And this is something that, depending on where you're from in the world, is more of an immediate concern and more of a, I guess, serious concept or topic than for others. But I think this idea of a Plan B, mobility prepping, it's becoming something that more Americans are into and becoming aware of as being necessary. Now, I wrote an article for the Las Vegas Sun about 3 years ago, September 2022. The title of the article is Why Americans Pursue Second Citizenship. And I won't read from the whole article, but there's one section that I titled Having a Plan B. And this is what I wrote. In national catastrophes, the most direct way to safety is to leave the danger zone. Whether facing war, famine, economic collapse, or totalitarian rule, the fastest solution on a personal level is geographical exit. People from countries less fortunate than the United States intimately understand this. For Ukrainians, Afghans, Venezuelans, and Yemenis, just in the last 12 months alone, seeing is believing. But the fact is lost on many Americans because good times have conditioned us to feel that our country is exempt from the same historical ebb and flow that collapses empires and raises new prosperous societies. Most of my American clients pursuing second citizenship reject this notion that we are exempt. They pursue a second citizenship to have a predetermined landing zone to safety as part of a Plan B. Now, for that excerpt, I was talking about citizenship and residency. Why do Americans who live in, possibly the freest country on earth, depending on what your viewpoint is, why would they pursue a second citizenship? And obviously, having a second citizenship, or a second residency, gives you a right of entry and residency in a foreign place. But there is a level, in my opinion, a level of mobility prepping that a person can achieve that requires way less of a time cost and a monetary cost and a commitment than actually going out and getting a second citizenship or residency. And that's basically being prepared, going all the way as far as you can, that's possible, to apply for a second citizenship or residency without doing so, right? And this has to do with basically how, what types of things a person needs typically in order to apply for a second citizenship or residency, a visa, any type of mobility benefit that would give them access to leave wherever it is that they are. So I want to talk about how I think about mobility prepping, what I recommend to clients, what I write about. And then obviously I'd like to hear from other people as well. How do you prepare to have maximum mobility? Do you do anything basically to be prepared in order to leave the danger zone in case your jurisdiction becomes a danger zone? What's the equivalent of canned beans and rice in the mobility world? What's the equivalent of a firearm and being able to have your first aid kit, et cetera, et cetera? As Alec Baldwin says in Glengarry, I'm going. So anyway, so I come at this mobility prepping question or concept, obviously from my experience as a citizenship and mobility attorney. So I like to think backwards. What are the things that hamstring applicants when they're looking to apply for a second citizenship or residency in a hurry? What are the things that delay us in being able to file the application and get the particular benefit, right? And this comes down to basically what I would consider two categories. One is documents, so document preparedness. And then secondly, information. Okay, so information that people need to fill out in applications. that's detailed about their past that they may not necessarily have available, or maybe they don't have it available at all. They have to actually go and research a little bit. So in the first category of document preparedness, right, we're obviously talking first and foremost about people's vital documents. Okay, so darn near anybody who's applying for a citizenship or a residency, let's call them a mobility benefit in another country, they need to provide their birth records, and then, of course, if they're married, typically a marriage record as well. Now, sometimes those documents have to be apostilled as well. Apostille is a higher level of authentication that's accepted by countries that are party to the Hague Apostille Convention. And this apostille, it's something that we're not that familiar with in the United States. I think most Americans don't actually know what an apostille is because we don't really use this in the United States for many things. And in fact, even for our own immigration, services, Department of State, USCIS, does not require apostilles of vital documents. So the first thing I think about is the vital document of the person, their marriage certificate, and then apostilles. Okay, and then depending on what other type of benefit they're applying for, sometimes they'll obviously want vital documents of ancestors. So first and foremost, Americans pursuing citizenship by descent elsewhere, they're going to obviously need birth records of their ancestors leading up to the qualifying ancestor. That's the basis of their eligibility. But that tends to be kind of a unique thing for citizenship by descent. I basically would qualify document preparedness as being your birth certificate, your marriage certificate if you're married, a valid passport, a valid ID. So if it's in the United States, your ID is typically a driver's license or state issued ID. Other countries have national IDs. And then birth records of your children if you have any. Okay. I believe 3 certified records is best practice. 3 certified copies of a document. I say if there's a stamp, seal, and fee, you should probably order 3. That's what I do for myself, and that's what I recommend all my clients do. And obviously, if they've hired me to go through a process for them, and if I'm gathering documents, I ask them if they want me to get 3 copies of documents. The vast majority of them say yes. We use 1 set of documents for the process that we're going through, the application we're filing, and then the client gets the other 2 documents at the end of the process. Now, what about authentications, right? Apostilles. Should you apostille the documents? Should you apostille all documents? I believe best practice for preparedness is to apostille 1 set of the 3 certified copies that you're getting. Just 1. Why just 1? Because first of all, not every country accepts apostilles. Other countries have different processes of legalization, super legalization. And some countries, of course, are not going to require an apostille or a high level of authentication at all, right? So I think 1 set of certified documents apostilled is best practice. Now, for somebody who's never gone through a process of apostilling a document in order to get a mobility benefit in a hurry, they might be thinking, well, what's the purpose of doing this all ahead of time? Can I just do it when I need it? And the answer is sometimes getting a document apostilled is really lengthy. Sometimes it's several weeks, sometimes it's even months, right? You typically apostille a document if it's a federal document in the United States, it's with the Secretary of State. It's with the Department of State, Office of Authentications. If it's a document issued by a U.S. state, you apostille that document typically from the state level Secretary of State. Sometimes it takes a few weeks, and sometimes it takes literally months. I had a few clients during the pandemic for whom I had to apostille documents. It took over 4 months. Oregon is one that comes to my mind off the top of my head. An Oregon birth certificate took over 4 months to apostille. Now, that's just apostilling the document. That's not the time it takes to order the certified copy. That can be several weeks itself. And then, of course, if you have to get a certified translation, then sometimes that can be a few weeks as well, too, especially if the certified translation requires the translator to have the physical copy with them and not just a PDF that's emailed to them. So I believe for document preparedness, at least the way I see it, 3 certified copies with 1 set that's apostilled is, I believe, best practice. And of course, I'd love to hear from other people here. We got Patrick here. Patrick, thanks for joining. I'm going to invite you to speak. Whenever you're ready, just jump on in. No need to invite yourself. And then the other thing is information preparedness, right? Info, right? This is for applications in which you're asked about your past, Past address history is a big one. Okay. Information about your parents. A lot of people don't actually know what their parents' birth date is. They don't know the city that their parents were born in. It happens all the time, right? Past educational history, past work history, including the addresses of the work. This sometimes takes a long time for people to research and to gather, right? If you want to be in a position where you're as prepared as possible to immediately pull the trigger to apply for a mobility benefit in a shit hits the fan situation to escape your jurisdiction, you want to have all of that information, at least the information that's most often required by processes, ready to go. Okay, saved on a scan on a cloud, saved in paper form as well. But hopefully, just in case for whatever reason you're not able to access your cloud. Now, going back to the documents. Okay, how should you save the documents? The documents that I said. I believe it should be basically saved in two ways. Okay, paper form and then basically on a cloud. On a cloud, all PDFs, right, accessible on the cloud, and then all certified copies accessible in hard copy. Obviously, people can do it the way they do it. You know, the way I like it, the way I recommend for people, and what I prepare for my own clients is a full leather brown binder, okay, with plastic sleeves in it. Okay, we fill up the plastic sleeves with the certified documents and the apostilles, okay, and then we separate them by tabs, okay. So birth certificate, marriage certificate, copy of your parents' birth certificate, whatever it may be that goes in there, right? It kind of looks handsome. It looks a little bit better than just a plastic binder, and obviously this is preparedness, but mobility prepping. But nobody says that it has to, you can't have a little bit of style, along the way. It can't look good, right? That's the way I do it. That's the way I recommend it. But obviously, there's more than one way of skinning a cat. The point is to have the info on the documents ready to go, so that if you have to apply in a moment's notice, you can literally contact an attorney or a consultant, or if you're doing it yourself, uh, fill out the forms and apply that day or the day after. People serially chronically underestimate how long it takes to prepare to submit a citizenship or a residency application. People are shocked by it. Okay, like I think the average person who's never applied for one thinks that they contact a person, and then they fill out a form, and then a day or two later they're submitting the application. People who are really dialed in can do that. Okay, but that is the absolute rarity. The vast majority of people are taking a few weeks to gather up all the documents and the information that's necessary at the fastest. I would say that's typically blazingly fast. Okay, so yeah, that's my take on it. um, anybody else that's in here that is into the topic of prepping, plan B, really what I consider mobility prepping to be is a skimmed down version of plan B, right? So plan B, of course, I think of it as being, having a second or third citizenship or residency. But mobility prepping, I think of it as a layer below that, not necessarily pulling the trigger just yet on those. Okay, maybe you don't have the money or the time, or you're not ready, but bringing yourself to the preparedness level just shy of being able to apply for any of those benefits if necessary. I see we have Jornio here as well. Welcome. I'm sure Jornio is going to have some more insightful comments. He always does. Patrick as well. Patrick, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I am joining you guys from the mean streets of New York. So if it's too noisy in the background, please let me know. Um, yeah, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. I am going to echo your structure on documents, getting them prepared, and kind of that tiered level of having several copies and then having several that are having one of those that are having a. And so I it's funny you say this because this is the first time I'm hearing it, and it's very much lines up with my own practice, and that is to have a digital copy on you of your documents, and then I also am a believer in having three physical documents. I take it one a little step further in that the ones that are not on me for travel or mobility reasons, I usually do the old-fashioned, like truly a prepper mentality, where I have one copy in a fireproof safe in one location and another copy in another fireproof location separate. That's a separate location. So, I come from California. I live on the East Coast. You know, I have been evacuated for fire. and earthquake and hurricane, it helps to have those documents in a place that's duplicated so that if there's a physical situation where your documents can get wiped out, you have a backup. And I know that sounds really overkill, um, but as a genealogist, I have thousands of dollars worth of records going back to the 1700s, issued by very arcane authorities. And so it's very easy for me to prepare a mobility prepper setup like that than it is to get those documents again. And I can give examples if that's useful, but I think the idea of having duplicated copies and copies that are ready to be used in multiple formats or multiple levels of authentication is the key to having that really prepper uh, mobility prepper setup.
I don't think it's overkill at all. And actually, I actually do the same thing you did. It's just I kind of didn't introduce it because of fear of it being considered overkill. But I actually do the same thing as well. When I have three, so for documents that I have three of, I have two separate binders actually. I have two in one binder, including the apostille copy, and then I have what I consider basically the backup binder, right, which has the third set of certified copies. I don't think it's overkill at all. But obviously, as with anything, there's levels, right? How prepared do you want to be? How comfortable, do you feel with basically going through those extra steps, right? Um, there's another level of potential preparedness with which patients brought up. Patients is alpha long time ago, which is background checks, right? So typically, if you're an American, as a lot of people know here, if you're asked for a background check from your country, it's typically the FBI identity history summary you're asked for. Not always, but it's typically that, right? And in fact, in most countries, if you're applying for a mobility benefit elsewhere, you're asked for some sort of police report. Those police reports become stale, okay, depending on the process, stale after 3 months. 3 months and 6 months is a common time frame, but it depends on the country. What Patience said, or what he floated, was the idea, and I don't do this yet, okay, but maybe this is an interesting service for somebody out there to provide. He floated the idea of getting your background check on a recurring basis. Okay, so twice a year. Okay, or obviously, however, maybe in an extreme situation, or maybe some super high net worth family office people out there want to do it. Maybe 4 times a year. Okay, just getting the background checks on a recurring basis, so that you always have a background check of yourself that's within the non-stale time period for the majority of programs. I think that's a really, really high level. Obviously, that's much more labor intensive than what we're talking about. But for some people, that might make sense, right? It's about what makes you feel comfortable and sleep at night, right? So I thought that's a really, really interesting concept. And I'd be curious if there's anybody out there that does that, or knows somebody who does that. I don't think I know anybody at that level, but, I can imagine if you really want max ability to immediately pick up and apply right away for a mobility benefit, that could be worth it. Oh, there he is. Patience, come forth and defend your idea or claim your idea. I'm just kidding. You don't have to come up right away, but I just invited you in case you want to speak. But yeah, anybody else? Giorno, what do you do do you do anything to mobility prep?
Hey, Barbie, it's good to talk to you. Yeah, I do actually. I live outside the United States, so uh, with the FBI background check, um, one thing that I do to prepare, kind of what Patience is Alpha was talking about, is I always keep about 10 fingerprint cards on me on person, and so I don't have to return to the United States to get a background check. All I do is I mail them to myself. I have a mail forwarding address in the United States. I mail them to myself. And then when the FBI background fingerprint card gets to the United States, I tell the mail forwarder to take out the international envelope. And inside I have a domestic envelope. And I have them forwarded that to the FBI channeler. And you can talk about the FBI channelers. But basically, as long as you have your fingerprint card ready to go, then all you need to do is send it into the United States and you can get your FBI background check. So that's what I've done in the past, and that's pretty helpful if you live outside the United States. Uh, I have some other things to say, but I think that's a pretty good little starter.
That's phenomenal, Giorno. And I want to just add on that real quickly. And then, of course, we'd love to hear whatever else you have to say. Um, as you're talking, it kind of dawned on me, there's kind of two levels, right, that a person can be prepared at vis-a-vis the FBI background check. If it's just about being able to apply for the FBI background check right away, your scenario is perfect. That's a great setup, actually. If it's about being able to have the FBI background check ready to be used, then oftentimes you're going to need an apostille for that as well. And that is, at least in my experience, during the time I've been practicing, that's usually the bigger time suck, time bottleneck. It's getting the apostille for the document more so than actually getting the document, right? Because you have to apostille that at the U.S. Office of Authentications in the Department of State, right? So the way I see it, and thank you, Giorno, for giving that great input. The way I see it is, there could be two levels, right? One is I think everybody, if you're an American living outside the United States, for sure, I think that's absolute bare minimum. Do what Giorno is saying. Have a bunch of fingerprint cards. It's the FD 1164, just in case anybody wants to look this up afterwards. Have a bunch of fingerprint cards ready to roll, mail forwarding, have that set up. And then if you want to take the extra level, okay, then you could also be regularly getting that background check, the way patient said, and getting it apostilled, right away. So you're always in a time period where you have a valid FBI background check that's apostilled. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think that level is necessarily for everybody. In fact, I don't think that's probably for most people. But for some people that are listening to this, or some people out there, they want to be maximally prepared. I think that would be a good practice.
Yeah, when you get that apostille, does it have to be for a specific country in DC? I don't remember. I've done it before, but do you have to tell which country it's for?
You have to tell which country it's for on the form, which is the DS 4194, but it's not. The country is not revealed on the face of the apostille. The reason that the form asks for the country is to make sure that you're giving it the proper type of authentication, because there's non-apostille authentications that exist as well too, legalization and super-legalization.
Well, in terms of, and I agree with you, this is something that most people would never use, but uh, if you really wanted to be prepared and you were wanting to have an apostilled FBI background check ready to go, would you not also have to know what country you're going to use it for beforehand? I don't know the answer.
No, because the apostille and the FBI background checks, it's country agnostic. It doesn't reference any country on the apostille. But
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Maybe what you meant is the possibility of applying for benefit in a country that's not party to the Hague Convention on Apostilles. In that case, of course, no, you might have to pursue a different authentication method. But the reason that I default to apostilles is because over 130 countries are party to the Hague Convention on Apostilles. So by default, statistically, right, like it's more likely you're going to be applying for a benefit in a country that's part of the Apostille Convention.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, most countries are a member of the Hague Convention, and so I mean, a lot of people. I think we might be above a lot of people listening if they listen to this recording later. But the if you're from the United States and you're in a foreign country and they ask for a police background check from the United States or from your country of citizenship, assuming you're an American, uh, they are talking about the FBI police report in pretty much all cases or most cases. In fact, in my experience, when I've offered the police report from whatever state I was from, they have said they're not interested. So and then you also in most countries you have to get that. It's not enough to have the FBI background check. You have to get it apostilled, and I think maybe you should go over that a little bit because that literally took me like years to understand what the hell's an apostille. What is that? Maybe you should go over that.
Sure, my pleasure. I never know how often to go over that, because I feel like on my account I'm constantly talking about it. So I'm like, oh, I'm boring people to death with this repetition. But yeah, the way you said it is exactly right. So there's a few different types of FBI background check actually, but the one specifically that's requested is it's called the identity history summary, right? So this is basically you have to render your fingerprints, you apply for the background check, you get that background check. I mentioned at the beginning of the spaces, the vast majority of Americans, in my experience, unless they've lived outside the United States, they have no idea what an apostille is. They may not have even heard of the term before. It's a higher level of authentication. It's an authentication from the competent authority, okay, in the jurisdiction that issued a document to say that the person who signed the document, whether it be a clerk or a records custodian, had the authority to do so. Okay, so it's a higher level of authentication, right? So, as Giorno said, the vast majority of countries, if they ask for a background check from you as an American, typically they want the FBI background check, the identity history summary. And if that country is part of the Hague Convention on Apostilles, they typically want that apostille as well. The apostille is it's literally one piece of paper that's affixed to the front of an official document, and it just has some info. It's like I think 16 or 17 fields on it. Okay, basically saying who's the authority that's authenticating it, where is it being authenticated, just some information like that. And so basically an apostille FBI background check, it will have that apostille on front, and then underneath it is the actual background check. And you should not separate the two. Oftentimes that invalidates the apostille if you physically separate it from the document. So for Americans that are globally mobile or aspire to be globally mobile, or get a second citizenship, third, fourth citizenship. If you're not familiar with the FBI background check, you will become very familiar with it, as I'm sure Giorno is, right? He's got that wonderful setup, so he knows, right? But yeah, that's basically, that's the upshot. The way you apostille it is through the U.S. Office of Authentications. For 4 years during COVID, you could only mail in the request. And that was a huge problem because they dealt with backlogs that sometimes were 2 months. Even there was a period where the backlog was 14 weeks. Okay. And that's a problem because, as I mentioned earlier, some benefits, mobility benefit, application processes require the FBI background check to be less than 3 months old. So those people would not have any chance of being able to render the FBI background check with their application in time. Now, in the fall of last year, 2024, the U.S. Office of Authentications opened up walk-in appointments. Okay, so it's in D.C. though, so there's walk-in appointments, but couriers have sprouted up offering services where you basically ship the FBI background check to the courier, they walk it in. It's still not. I mean, it's way faster than it was before, but it's still a little timely. You're still looking at about 2 to 3 weeks to go through the whole process. But yeah, that's basically how FBI background checks and apostilles work.
I want to dig in slightly on this a little bit more with a little bit of the more tactical approach on the FBI background check, because as an American in America, it's easy for me to go. So to issue an FBI background check, you have to submit fingerprints um, to confirm that you are who you say you are and have this document released. And so the most convenient and the fastest and the least messy way to do this, if you are in America, big caveat, is to do it through a participating post office location. And as a person who is in an urban center in the United States, that's relatively easy for me to say and do. But if you're living abroad, that option, to my knowledge, is not available to you. And so issuing fingerprints requires you to physically get your fingers inked. And I've had that process done before. It's really messy. It's like dealing with squidding. Um,
It,
like if you're living abroad, and this is a question for anyone, but a little bit towards Giorno. Do you get your fingerprints done all at the same time, like at a police precinct when you're in the United States, where you get 10 of them done and then you send them to yourself for future use? Or what's the best
uh,
way to get those fingerprints done?
well, the best way to get them done is, if you're an American, is next time you're in the U.S., any town, any city will have a police officer, off-duty private investigator, whatever. They have to be certified. You can't do it yourself, and you can't just, have your grandpa do it. you have to have somebody who's certified, and they have to fill out their little ID number and their certification number, or whatever. It's like an official card. Uh, Parvis knows the name of it, I forget. But the point is, anywhere you fly into LA, maybe a couple days if you're outside the U.S., whatever it is, you fly into New York, wherever you are, and you look online, just do a search, whatever town you're in, fingerprint cards, and you can find somebody who's certified. I've done it in towns. I had one person who was a private investigator, and they were certified and whatever. But the point is, they never expire. You get 10 of them, you get 20 of them, whatever, and you stick them in your backpack, and you bring them back to wherever you're living. You can put them in your bank. You can stick them with your important documents that you have, maybe your laptop, whatever, and they're just ready to go. They're just always there for you. Now, the issue is when you're ready to fill out that background check, you want to be able to send them to in my experience, the FBI channeler. So I always, and that's another really important thing, have a mail forwarding address in the U.S. set up so you can mail yourself documents from abroad. And not all mail forwarders allow international mail. So that's another thing you have to be aware of. If you have a family member, that works too. So I think a lot of people would have a family member that could do it. But the point is, you send yourself one of the documents in the U.S., and you have a little piece of paper with the FBI channeler, information, and then you have that forwarded to the channeler, and then they send that your fingerprint card and whatever information else you need, and they have your background check process.
Thanks, Giorno. Giorno, I got good news for you. The person who takes your background, your fingerprints doesn't have to be certified. You can do it yourself, actually. That's one of the first things I tested out, and I still test it regularly. So, I'm not sure what the letter of the law is, or what the reg. Maybe there's a reg out there that says the person has to be certified. But I've requested my own at least 8 times, maybe 10 times over the last several years. Never rejected for the fingerprints having been rolled by somebody who's not certified. Now,
That's interesting. That's
mhm.
very interesting, by the way. I did not know that because I do know on the fingerprint card it has the like information for the person who did the fingerprints, but I didn't know you could just put yourself. That's very interesting.
That's exactly what I put on there. I put myself. Now, the channelers obviously have to be certified, right? I think it's some sort of mini license or whatever. I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because people ask, okay, well, how do you submit? Who do you submit to, right? And the bottom line is, for fingerprints, there's 3 ways of submitting, right? One is, as Patrick said at the beginning, the USPS office, right? Qualifying USPS offices, you can walk in, get your fingerprints taken there, no ink, it's just taken digitally. The second way is to get your fingers nasty, right, with ink, right, and basically render your fingerprints that way. And then the third way is through a channeler, which is basically like private businesses that basically can live scan. They can take your fingerprints and basically submit. I'm not aware of any live scan location that's competent to request your FBI background check outside of the United States. Last I checked was 7-8 months ago. I couldn't find any. But if anybody's heard of some or used one, please speak up and let us know. But as far as the fingerprints are concerned, yeah, I mean, you get the cards, FT 1164. If it's on cardboard, great. Even if it's on paper, I've so because I'm just a nutcase and I'm curious, I have submitted all kinds of weird, iterations of my own fingerprints just to see what happens, just to see what works and what doesn't work. I won't bore you with the details of all the little experiments, but the upshot is, if the fingerprints are rolled well, properly, okay, meaning you can see the lines, and if the fingers are mostly inside the designated boxes, every time they've been accepted, and I've gotten my own FBI background check. But as far as having, like, for example, I've omitted social security, number on the form. I basically rolled myself. I just did a lot of different weird things. All of them worked so far, except when it was a low quality fingerprint that I gave.
Yeah, well, and with the channelers, I've never used them to get my fingerprints. I always just what I do is you do a search FBI channeler, and there's a bunch of them, and they're basically registered. They're licensed to process your background check, I believe, and maybe I'm misquoting that, but basically, I send them the fingerprint card already filled out, and I send them a check, or whatever, some sort of payment method. Maybe I pay online and fill out a little form, from whatever company is the FBI channeler, and put my name and stuff. And then they do the background check and they give me the results. And it's usually very quick. It's like a couple days.
That's phenomenal. So what I believe is happening there is the channeler is basically offering as a service the ability to basically use your fingerprints that's on a card to go through their channels to request the report. I'm familiar. That's actually very interesting because I don't know if I've ever had a client do that, or I've definitely not done it myself. But the way we usually do it is basically just send the client in if they're close to a channel or if they like it in person in the United States. I've not had a client do it that way, but that's great. I'm glad you mentioned that. That's
Yeah,
another
that's
option for clients.
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's great. If you're abroad, I mean, you just send them a check and a fingerprint card, and you get your results a couple days later. You don't gotta do anything. So it's really convenient.
Sweet. So, what other documents, right? So some people, not everybody obviously that's a US citizen is born in the United States, right? Some people naturalize the United States, or some people are obviously born outside of the US and then, to American parents. In those cases, there's a couple additional vital documents that a person, might have that's critical. Okay, one is obviously the certificate of naturalization, and the other one is a CRBA, consular report of birth abroad, right? Those are what I consider bottleneck vital documents. And what I mean by that is those are documents that have kind of a habit of being difficult and lengthy to obtain, right? Especially CRBAs from people that are older, born in the 60s, 50s, 40s. If you've naturalized the United States or if you were born abroad to a US citizen parent, I highly, highly, highly recommend getting those two documents, the CRBA and the certificate of naturalization. Now, for the certificate of naturalization, getting the recommended three might be cost prohibitive because they're so damn expensive. They're over $500 each, right? But you should definitely have at least one, get it apostilled. And if it's the CRBA, in my opinion, you should get the typical three and then get basically one of them apostilled.
What
I
when
have a
is
client,
CRBA?
sorry,
Sorry, when is CRBA?
consular report of birth abroad. So when a person, you're going to like this one, Jono, when somebody is born abroad to a US citizen and the parent wants to basically register their birth to be recognized as a US citizen, they file for a CRBA, certificate, what did I say? Certificate,
Register
Of,
something
re,
abroad?
or I had a brain fart here. It's a certificate report of birth abroad. I got to look this up because I'm having a brain fart here.
You
It's a
got it earlier.
CRBA. Consular report, excuse me, consular report of birth abroad.
Yeah, the birth certificates in the United States are quite easy to obtain. And my understanding is most states they have a 24-hour like hotline you can call, and it's a private contract with a company, Vita Records, or you would know this, parties, some company basically, and it's all over the phone, and it's like really fast, and they'll just mail out your document wherever you need it, so it's really convenient in most states.
Convenient, yes. Not fast. It always depends on the state, right? So I've ordered birth certificates from probably, I haven't counted it up, but I'd guess maybe 25 to 30 of the states. Some are very fast, some are very convenient, but they also have different evidentiary standards for proving your identity, right? So some states, even if you go through Vital Check, that's the contractor, some are going to require a copy of your ID. Some are going to require even a notarization, basically request. So it depends on the state. It sounds like maybe if you ordered for yourself, maybe you're from a state that, that doesn't have onerous evidentiary standards for proving your identity to order the birth certificate. But yeah, it is cool to go through Vital Check when they, obviously when they have the record. And my experience has been that for birth records, they're pretty solid. That's my go-to. I'll go first to Vital Check. Most of the time it works. If not, then we have to dig deeper.
Yeah, and that should be made clear before I started doing all this. I always thought your birth certificate was something the hospital issued, and you got one of them, and hold on tight to it, and stuff like that. And that's not true at all. At least in the United States, I mean, I assume if you're born, 95 years ago, maybe it's a little harder. But if you're like 40, 50 years old, whatever, in the United States, you should be able to get a certified copy of your birth certificate pretty easily from most places in the U.S. So that is good to know. If you don't have one with you and you don't have a copy of it, whatever, you can generally replace it pretty easily. The U.S. has pretty good records generally.
Absolutely right. And that's why I recommend get three. Patrick, too, he recommends, right? Three. Get three certified copies, Apostille one.
Yeah, I'll jump in here and digress slightly on the naturalization documents. I personally think because those documents are so difficult to get a hold of, not necessarily researching it, but just the time to request it. I'm preaching. I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on TV. But I'm a genealogist, and so sometimes it's very difficult for me to go to a client and say, "Yes, I can get that record," but my request time is 14 months just to figure out whether or not something exists, and then another 14 months to get the physical copy from USCIS. So I do think whether or not people are eligible or not for citizenship by descent or some type of benefit from their ancestry, if you have an ancestor that naturalized in history, just get the document and get it in triplicate now. It is far and away the most difficult document to get, particularly in tight time constraints. And then you can just save it. You can keep it. Some consulates don't even require you to apostille it. I suspect that's probably going to change in the future. But even then, it's much easier to face a State Department apostille timeline of 6 to 10 weeks as opposed to almost 2 years to retrieve the initial document. So that's my first thought on the document piece. But the other one also is that I tell I tell this to people who are like generally researching to see whether or not they're eligible for citizenship through Ancestry, and that is that there are essentially three types of situations where someone's name changes legally. And the most common one, of course, is it's a female getting married. The most uncommon is going before a court and just legally changing your name. Um, but and I've dealt with both of those scenarios. But the one that people often forget is naturalization also functions as the possibility to change your name because it produces your identity as a naturalized citizen. And so oftentimes when researching and looking into one's history, they have to use the name that their ancestor originally had when they applied to become a citizen, not necessarily the name they used once they became a citizen. And that document functions as proof of a name change. And so if you're tying documents together going back in history, that document is necessary. And so, uh, you know, obviously I'm tooting my own horn here, but even if you have the ancestor from Ireland who naturalized in 1863, like that document still exists. It's probably with a state archive, and it's worthwhile to get it while you can because doing that research, or if they naturalize later, dealing with USCIS, both of those situations are very time intensive. So that's my little bit on kind of document prepping.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you're applying for citizenship through Ancestry, obviously one of the main things you have to do is prove the person that you're submitting documents for is the person you say they are in the chain of lineage, right? And that's where we have problems with name changes, with nicknames, like John going to from Jonathan, right? Like cutting off names, or even just misspellings, right? Misspellings in the names, even misspellings in the countries. Okay, ship manifest records where the person came from Slovakia, but Slovenia is written. Okay, things like that. So the way I think about proving a case for citizenship through Ancestry is, right, you have to basically, we want to make sure that we're proving every person that we're submitting documents for is the person, okay, that handed off the football. Okay, that's the person's mother. Okay, and this is the same person that gave birth to this person, and that's the person who gave birth to the next person in the generational line, etc. Patrick, the fourth way for name changes, right, is the most common one actually, and the most difficult to deal with, which is name change by common usage. Okay, so at common law, And still, in many states, it might be the majority of states in the United States, you still legally change your name actually through common usage over an extended period of time. That's what the law says. I mean, this is where the issue comes, the dichotomy between what the law is and then proving a point, right, under the law. That's obviously, messier, more difficult, requires much more, bolstering evidence, right? But that's still a name change that's recognized at common law and in many U.S. states, if not the majority. But yeah, obviously, if you can prove something with one document instead of 20 documents, you take the path of least resistance, which is exactly what Patrick said. So, marriage, naturalization, those types of big events in which you're, and then of course court order, where you're getting some sort of document from an authority saying that we recognize your name has been changed.
Yeah, I was going to say one document that is handy to have as well is some sort of professional reference, because I have had experiences applying places and they require a professional letter of some reference, and it can't be like an employer, it can't be a family member, a friend, it's got to be like a lawyer. And sometimes you have to have known them for a year or two. So it's not a bad idea if you're listening to this and you don't have a lawyer in your life to just set up a consultation, have like some sort of person that you can, in theory, in a year or two, be like, hey, that I need that letter of recommendation. You know me, I'm honest. You have experience with me. Just some sort of professional letter. I that kind of threw me for a curveball in some of these places I've applied for. So that's good to have. That
But the rule
connection.
is, if you do that journal, you cannot make lawyer jokes for 12 months from the time you request the letter. That's the rule.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. We all love lawyer jokes. Yeah, that's absolutely right, actually. And in fact, I've I've noticed that that's often a requirement in former British colonies. I can't remember off the top of my head which countries I'm thinking about, but yeah, some sort of letter of recommendation, and then they'll list off, like the professions that qualify. Sometimes it's like even an accountant, right, can qualify as being one of those people, and sometimes they ask for stamps. Actually, I was contracted by a lawyer in a foreign country to write a legal opinion letter on a point, and they asked me to stamp it, and I was like, I don't have a stamp, and that actually kind of triggered me to go on and prepare myself to get a stamp, just for those jurisdictions in which it matters. But yeah, it's a great point, Journal.
And
Yeah.
that's also a great point. I'll just say real quick, a lot of places outside the U.S., lawyers have stamps. Like, that is a super, super common thing around the world. And the U.S., of course, everything's just signature. So that's also something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I was going to add, I know for Ireland, they need a person in the community who is licensed by the public. And so it can be an accountant, it can be a pharmacist. Um, it's a pretty unique list, but I think I think from the American perspective, it seems a little old fashioned, but if you back into the logic, you can see why it exists. In Canada, a person can be a guarantor, um, but they have to have known you for 2 years and be a Canadian citizen. So it's closer to that threshold of a friend or a reference, but their stamp is essentially their proof of citizenship.
Yeah, so in countries where you're a citizen of, or you have residence in, it's not a bad idea to have. I think the easiest is in a lawyer or an accountant, that you have some sort of professional relationship, and it doesn't have to be like really intense, but even just one meeting, you pay them for reviewing something, and now you have a relationship, and you've known each other, and that clock starts to tick. It's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I'm going to also add on to here that I think for anyone who's operated in this space at some point has had to potentially use a foreign lawyer, and I'm going to use that as a little bit of a transition because it involves typically using a foreign power of attorney. And so let's say you're trying to set up residence in a foreign country, or you're doing a citizenship application, whether it be CBI or citizenship by Ancestry. In the event that you need someone to operate in the legal space, you have to have a lawyer in that country who's reputable and can act on your behalf while you're not there. That, by definition, is kind of what you want a power of attorney for in this context. And getting that power of attorney signed is an incredibly lengthy process for anyone who's ever done it. It involves So going back to the apostille aspect of documents, those documents, civic documents, are already signed by a public official. That's what makes them able to have an apostille affixed to them for international authentication. But if you're just signing a regular contract, it's just your signature and someone else's signature. Nobody in there is a public official. And so it cannot be automatically apostilled. What happens is you have to get it notarized by a local notary in the United States. Then, to confirm that that notary is in fact a real notary, you have to have it certified by the secretary or the clerk of the county. And then on top of that, then you can send it into the state for an apostille. So it goes from local notary to county certification to state apostille. Then you can send it abroad and use it, to execute a POA. End to end, that's a 12-week process for most people. And I think that if there's any documents that you require that are not issued by uh, you know a, a civic organization or signed by a civic individual, it's something to consider. Like, for example, if you're printing something off of Ancestry and you need to use it and it's acceptable, chances are it's probably not. But if you are using it as evidence, you would have to sign it and then go through that entire process because it's just a piece of paper you sent out of your printer.
Yeah, and a lot of times these, every country, they have these documents have a timer on them. So once you get that first stamp, clock's ticking. And so it's always kind of a race against the clock sometimes, depending on where you're applying, to get all these documents and go through all the processes so that by the time you get them all completed, they're all completed roughly about the same time, and none of them are too old to submit. At least that's been my experience in some places.
Yeah, I actually have a good side story for you on that, and that is um, that the issuing authority on documents can change too. A perfect example is birth certificates. So when you get a birth certificate, it's typically from the county because that's the closest issuing authority where you register the birth when you're born. But then when you're getting documents for moving abroad, it's typically issued by the state and the state registry of births, which I recommend to everyone because a state in the United States is far and away more recognized than an individual county. But 30 years ago, many large cities could also issue birth certificates. So I've had situations where clients come to me and they say, "Oh, I'm not on speaking terms with my father, but I have his birth certificate, and it was issued from the city of Philadelphia in 1996." And you're like, "Well, the city of Philadelphia doesn't issue birth certificates anymore, um, to my knowledge. Others, you might correct me on that, but um, I know other major cities that used to issue birth certificates and no longer do. And so, if you were to send that in to get an apostille, I don't think it can be apostilled because the civic signature on that civic document, on that civic registry document, uh, it no longer really exists with that power to issue that document. And so I think, when you order these documents, you want to make sure that you're ordering it from probably the most established authority that has the power to issue those documents because it will likely last the longest. Um, and so that's a pretty nerdy and deep take on it, but I do think it's important because I have seen it show up a few times.
I think it's a great point, Patrick, and it illustrates the concept, right, that the credibility of a document, it's better viewed on a spectrum than as a toggle switch. Right? It's on a spectrum. Some documents, as presented, have more credibility, right? And credibility is in the eye of the beholder, which is the foreign, agency or adjudicator that you're using it for, right? Than others, right? And so you always want documents to be the most credible and appear the most credible, right? So I entirely agree with you as a heuristic, right? It's not going to be the case in every scenario, but as a heuristic, county is more credible than city. State is more credible than county. Federal authority is more credible than statewide, right? And one example that comes to my mind is criminal background checks, right? we said that most countries, if you're applying for a mobility benefit there as an American, they will ask for the FBI identity history summary. That's true. But there's a few, and I don't want to put them on blast here, but there are a few, okay, that will accept a background check that's at a lower level than the FBI. Okay, so state level background checks. There's even a few countries that have accepted county level background checks. Like you literally go to the police report, they say, hey, we have no record of you in this county. That's obviously a much more gameable system, right? Because, Joe Schmo was convicted of DUI in, Clark County, and then they say, oh, I've been living in Dade County now. Here's my Dade County certificate. But yeah, the credibility of the document definitely matters. And I guess I'll just use this as an opportunity to segue into mobility prepping for people who have a criminal record, right? I don't expect somebody to come forth and, express their own personal experience with their criminal record, right? The bottom line is lots of Americans, tens of millions of Americans, estimated 70 million plus have at least a misdemeanor. It's a lot of people, right? Because the reality is you could just do something stupid as a kid or as a young adult and, get a, petite larceny or a DUI. Lots of people have it. If you're an American and you have had a brush with the law, okay, first of all, one thing that blew my mind when I first experienced this as a practitioner about 10 years ago is I would say at least half of the people who have a misdemeanor conviction in the United States but did not serve jail time as a result. Okay, they typically plead out and did some sort of community service or some sort of diversion program. I would estimate at least half of them do not understand that they actually have a conviction. Half of them think that they were arrested and blah blah blah. It's fuzzy. Something happened and the charge was dropped or they let me go. They don't understand. Yeah, you took a plea deal and that's a conviction. That's on your record. So I say to people, really everybody, not just if you have a brush with the law, but especially if you ever had a brush with the law, and I would classify that as the threshold being if you were ever fingerprinted by law enforcement, ever, regardless of what you think happened afterwards, you must run your FBI background check to see what's on it, what shows up in the FBI CGIS. Plenty of people are surprised and caught totally off guard by what's on it, right? And what I mentioned is just one example. People are caught off guard by having the wrong country of citizenship, the wrong date of birth. Okay. I had a client who hired me to challenge his FBI background check. He knew that he was arrested. He knew that he was convicted of something, but the caption of his conviction in the FBI background check shows a crime against a minor, a sexual crime against a minor. It's the wrong caption. Okay. The FBI, actually, it was the Cal DOJ. They mixed up the statute for his conviction, which had nothing to do with minors, with a caption for a crime against a minor. That looks terrible for the guy, obviously. If you just glance at the FBI background check, it looks like he's like a child predator. So you absolutely want to get your FBI background check. That's just a start, right? If you have something on there, then you're going to have to chase down more reports and kind of get to the bottom of what's going on there. But the easy first step, the initial threshold, is get your FBI identity history summary, find out what's on it, review it carefully. And in fact, I've been delaying for months, but I'm going to put forth a video and an article of what I think are best practices for going over your own FBI background check to just check that everything's on it, both for if you have a criminal record or if you have no criminal record at all.
Yeah, one thing I want to bring up now, most people, well, I wouldn't say most, but a lot of people who work with you, Parvis, are probably American citizens. But it's really important to keep in mind if you've lived outside the US for any significant amount of time, or if you're a citizen of multiple countries already, that oftentimes when you apply for citizenship or residency in a country, they will ask you for a lot of these documents like police reports and so on from any country that you're a citizen of and or countries that you've lived in for longer than like 6 months. I've seen it 6 months. I've seen it 1 year. And so if you're like living abroad in some country for a year and you don't really think anything of it, when you go to apply for citizenship, now all of a sudden you're required to get these documents from this other country that you were in. Or if you're a dual citizen, you might have to get records from this other country that you're a citizen of. I've experienced that. So don't just assume that you can necessarily just rely on one country and get all the documents from that one country, because I have seen a lot of times countries that you're applying at will look at countries, they'll ask you point blank, have you lived anywhere for longer than a year or 6 months? And what are your nationalities? And give us police reports and so on from those countries as well. So There's a lot of moving parts you got to consider.
Absolutely right. In fact, I just had a consultation with a potential client last week. Wants to apply for Slovak citizenship by descent. He's only in his 40s, but he's lived multiple years in 3 European countries and 1 Latin American country, and he's a US citizen. And so, 20 minutes, not 20, 15 minutes of that consultation was explaining to him the slalom that he's going to have to run through at the end of the document preparation in order to get all those background checks, get them authenticated, the ones that have to be, right? Because some of them are from an EU country, in which case there might be an apostille waiver, and then apply. So that's a huge deal. Now, the other thing is, different countries have different background checks, even multiple types of background checks. Which one is the background check, that they want? Sometimes if you're DIYing it, right? I guess this is less of a concern if you're going with a professional, but if you're DIYing it and you're seeing that the application says a police certificate or a background check from any country you've been resident in for at least 6 months, the question is, okay, well, which one? What if you pull up, you start doing some research and you pull up, a country and you see that they have multiple types of background checks? Obviously, I can't give a one size fit all answer for all, but what I will say is that my starting point is actually the U.S. Department of State website. Okay, so for the U.S. Department of State website, under the visa reciprocity table, has excellent information on all of the civil documents, issuing authorities, what it looks like, what it's titled for all countries in the world. That's my starting point. I pull that up. I see what does the visa reciprocity table say about what's available in this country. Okay, and then I go on from there to figure out what I think is most likely going to be required if there's not clarity on it. 9 times out of 10, the report that the U.S. Department of State asked for a person that's been that's a citizen or been resident in that country, it's the same one that the other countries want. So not always, but most of the time it is.
Yeah, question for you, Parvis. If you, I mean, I know you're an attorney and you're going to recommend everybody do things honestly and no shenanigans and all that. But just as a philosophical thought experiment, if somebody were, let's say they were, backpacking around the world or something like that, and they lived in, 5 different countries for a year each, and they wanted to apply for citizenship in, let's say, country A, and they were living, in all these countries, and then they apply for citizenship in this country, and they didn't disclose some of the countries that they were in for a year to try to slow down the amount of documents. Is there any sort of global immigration thing that would immediately catch them or flag them? Again, this is purely an interesting question, not something I recommend people do.
Yeah, I don't recommend people do that either. Obviously, I'll get that out of the way. I'm not aware of a universal global information sharing, apparatus specifically regarding physical presence that people have spent in different countries. I cannot say definitively that it does not exist, but I'm not aware of it. Right. With regards to slowing down the process, aside from the fact of obviously doing things above board and honest and all that type of stuff, I'm not a fan of that because I think it provides it provides a fragile mobility benefit. Okay. I define robustness of a mobility benefit as basically its resistance to involuntary degradation over time. You're going to live, hopefully, knock on wood, for 30, 40, 50 more years. Okay. You want it to be that if you apply for especially permanent residence or a citizenship elsewhere, that's solid. You have that for life. All your kids are going to have that. Future kids are going to have that, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's rarely worth it, even if there's a big slowdown, it's rarely worth it. So putting aside the ethical considerations entirely, it's rarely worth it, in my opinion, to save that time. Unless you're in an absolute emergency, got to get out of Dodge, shit hit the fan situation. It's rarely worth it to save a few months of processing and make that little crack, that little latent liability, which is what I call it. Okay, a liability that's under the surface, may not rear its head for 10, 15, 20 years, but it's always floating there and can come up, especially if your application gets scrutiny. And sometimes for your next generation, your application will get scrutiny, right? If your kid is applying for a benefit as a citizen, especially a citizen by descent, based off of you being a citizen and you naturalize there, that can that can result in a microscope being put over your application and how you got citizenship even years later. So short answer to your question is I'm not aware of any such database that's that comprehensive. US obviously is the biggest bully, with data sharing. So, of all countries, I consider the US, probably the most capable of getting detailed information from other countries, but I'm not aware of a global integrated info sharing. But patients might have something to say about that, or maybe Amin actually, because these guys work in intelligence. So if either of you guys have any thoughts, feel free to step forward.
Hey guys, hey, I'm not sure there is, but there is a bunch of data out there. There's travel data that is shared, that's for sure. We know there's airline data that is shared. There's tax data that is shared, CRS, that kind of know. And it's probably, like you said, it's probably the first thing someone would attack if there's a, especially if you end up being someone publicly visible. It's probably something I would avoid. I've been in that case as well because I've lived in some geos for like less than 12 months or things like that, and some migration programs are like any place where you held residence. And unfortunately, that had me qualify for that. And then we go back to the original issue you had. All of a sudden, you're looking for background checks and fingerprints in a different geo, and it's a pain. So I get that, but like you said, it probably would make the migration benefit thinner, to a certain extent, really close to a permanent residency, something that can be revoked anytime. So I'll be cautious.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, even through the U.S. Freedom of Information Act, you can actually request information regarding your own travels on flights. I don't know if I can't recall if it's just flights that arrived in the United States, or even if it's airlines that travel to the United States, even if it's regarding a flight that was entirely outside the United States. And the upshot is like that's a huge illustration of how much information the United States demands from not just foreign countries, but foreign private companies as well. So 100% agree, patients. There's so much data out there, especially recently. Before you even get to the ethical considerations of not answering the truth on that question, it's not. I don't perceive a practical benefit if you consider timeline. If a person just has a snapshot, get the benefit now versus delay by 3 months and then get the benefit, okay, then they're going to see a distorted view. I think these mobility benefits have to be looked at and their robustness over the timeline of your life, the rest of your life, and then the life of your children, to the extent that their benefit is going to be based off of and vulnerable to any chinks in the armor of how you got your citizenship.
Yep, I think there are two things that you cannot fake. One is the actual residence, time spent on the ground for migration benefit, and the other one is the absence of residence. And those two, I would strongly advise not to. There have been cases of people being denied because of fake residencies because they thought they could actually scam like the absence of borders of the Schengen agreement. Things like, hey, I'm spending 5 years in Luxembourg, but actually what I've done is I rent a place in Luxembourg and I'm driving to France and actually, live in France or things like that behind the scenes. And those things have been uncovered. There are many, many cases of this.
Yeah, I mean, we're all carrying the biggest surveillance device around with us daily, right? 20 hours a day, or sometimes 24 hours a day, our cell phones.
Yeah.
I wanted to come back to the point of birth certificates, because I think one thing that we haven't touched that is peculiar to some countries. I've run into that when I'm naturalized. Is that some countries will start issuing you birth certificates once you naturalize in their countries. For example, France is one of these. When you become French, you can now ask the French equivalent of the Department of State for a birth certificate that essentially mimics the data that you have provided them. And then this birth certificate is issued by France, even though you were not born a French citizen. That means this birth certificate, and that's something that I'm trying to test nowadays. This birth certificate can be the basis for some immigration programs. I'll report when I'm done with that, but it can be the basis for some immigration programs, even though you became a naturalized citizen. And France is one of the countries that does that. I don't know about other countries. Probably some of them do, but it's a really interesting one, because if your other country of citizenships are harder to get an apostille from, harder to get a certified document from, you can maybe test on these ones. So I'll report on that when I have some news.
Patience, you're referring to a situation in which you or the person's not born in France, and
Correct.
then they naturalize. Yeah,
Correct.
That's right. Yeah, several countries do that, both in Europe and in the Middle East. Yeah, that would be a fantastic, case study as like a sort of vital documents extension cord, right? To be able to see if you can just rely entirely on those documents, to get third country benefits. That's super interesting.
And
Yeah.
that is outside of the scope of someone who would be a refugee. Sorry, Patrick, but someone who would be a refugee could have that as a benefit. But let's say someone who's born in Germany, who's German and naturalizes in France, ends up getting a new birth certificate, a new French birth certificate on top of the German one.
Yeah, absolutely. And refugees and asylees are kind of the people that those types of courtesies are extended most to, because it is a kind of a principle of asylum law that you should not be availing yourself of benefits of the country that you are applying for asylum from, that you're claiming persecution from, right? The big one that comes to my mind, and we've seen it, come up, is trying to get a passport. Okay, you're claiming asylum from a certain country, and then you're trying to renew your passport from that country. That can interfere, even nullify your asylum claim in a third party country. So I'm just spitballing. I've not seen this yet. Maybe this scenario is out there, but I'm thinking to myself, the people that would be best suited to be able to do what you're saying, Patience, and to make the argument for it, is an asylee claiming asylum from their home country, right? And basically unable to avail themselves of any type of benefit from the country, issuance of a passport or vital document, etc. And whether, getting that document from the second country, let's call it the country of naturalization, could work.
Yeah. I don't want to speak over anyone because this is fascinating. I was just going to add in a tiny little story, and that is uh, in a citizenship by descent angle. And that is, some countries, when you pursue citizenship by descent, they go back into the register and put in all your ancestors as foreign born. So you can then request a birth certificate, even though you weren't born in the country. um, you know, there are people out there who can do that. Myself may or may not be included in that. But I have seen this in situations where people from certain Latin American countries, noticeably Venezuela, where getting a birth certificate requires a significant bribe to a local official and not a guarantee that you will even get the document sort of situation. That's true for passports, but that's even true for vital documents. Sometimes people rely on um, church records because they're easier to get than civic records in a country like that. And so when they got citizenship by descent, they always and will forever use their, in this case, Italian birth certificate as opposed to the birth certificate in their home country, partly because it's just an access question. But the second one is probably because their foreign birth certificate in their new country is just easier and more accepted across the board than their birth certificate from Venezuela, given the levels of corruption or disruption in their country. I know that's different from naturalization by a significant margin, but I thought I'd throw it in there because it seems to be kind of sort of the other side of the coin on that.
No, Patrick, I think what you said is squarely in the same category. The point is, a birth certificate issued by an authority that's not competent in the jurisdiction that the person was born in. Okay, so whether that be by naturalization or because the person was born outside of the country. Yeah, that's interesting. So Patrick, have you seen people, clients or otherwise, be able to, with great success, use those second country birth certificates to get third country mobility benefits?
Yeah, 100%. Several years ago, when I was learning a foreign language, I had a series of tutors who I would speak to who were based in Europe. And it was beneficial to me because I could wake up at 5 in the morning and do an hour of conversation in a foreign language. And several of them were Latin American speakers. They spoke Spanish or Portuguese or from Latin America, but they lived in several places. They lived in Spain. They lived in some technically jurisdictions of the UK, but all of them had ancestors who were Italian, and so they had an Italian citizenship. They had an Italian birth certificate, but they were then using that for additional mobility within Europe. And so, and they were language tutors, so they naturally wanted to be a little bit location independent because they would teach on their own and then with a regular day job, and then that could change year over year. So they had this enhanced mobility. I think it tends to be not unique, but better in Europe, given the kind of the cross acceptance of a lot of documents there. I haven't yet seen it in a scenario where it's just outside of that EU kind of nexus. So if someone's using a European document as someone who's born in Latin America in, say, Eastern Asia, or in a pretty like heterodox place like Africa, I haven't seen that yet. I wouldn't be surprised if it's better or beneficial, but everything is so idiosyncratic that I'm sure there's examples that highlights its benefits and others where it might present some pretty significant challenges.
One thing I want to say regarding today's topic, mobility prepping, preparing for a plan B, is a lot of times when you're doing these applications, it really is in your interest to hire somebody to help you, and most people do. But like in my experience, if you spend a few $1,000s to have somebody who's there on the ground, who understands the process, speaks good English, knows the legal system, like whatever money you pay them ends up coming back to you in saved money. Generally speaking, now of course there can be bad people out there. There can be people who are not trustworthy and stuff like that. So I'm only talking about people who are legitimately reputable. But I'll also say too, it helps to get two opinions. So think of it like a doctor. If you're really considering a years-long process to get a couple opinions from a couple different firms or agents or whatever. But in my experience, I've applied places, and if I had tried to do it myself, I would have had to redo the document several times. It's in a different language. It's just totally worth it to have somebody else doing this for you in many ways.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jono, especially about the second opinions. So I'm constantly meeting and trying to meet foreign lawyers. I refer cases wholesale sometimes to foreign lawyers, and sometimes I subcontract to or even work hand in hand with foreign lawyers, depending on the issue or what type of case we're doing. And I can definitely say, I mean, in my experience, it's tough, I guess, to put a ratio on it, but I would say at least for every 5 foreign lawyers that I have a meeting with, that I'm trying to set up some sort of relationship with, that really I really only end up proceeding with maybe one out of 5, I'd say, probably at best. I guess this is a little bit politically incorrect to say, but obviously the standards for the legal profession vary wildly from country to country, right? And I'm sure somebody could accuse me of being biased because I'm from the United States and I'm licensed here, but the standard of what's expected from the legal profession in the United States is pretty high compared to other lawyers. That's not to say there's, all bad lawyers. There's some great lawyers in foreign countries, but the bottom line is you really have to check. I mean, second opinion, great. If you have somebody that's gone with the previous attorney and they got, they vouch for them, okay, maybe that's enough. But you do really have to do your due diligence in dealing with foreign lawyers. There's, I don't want to pick on any particular countries, but there's these expressions out there for a reason, island time and things like that.
Yes, and it varies wildly by country, I've noticed as well. There's a huge variance.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some countries that are just very difficult. Let's put it that way. Very difficult to find a high professional standard. Where lawyers treat themselves like fiduciaries, etc. But there's one other thing that I wanted to touch on, actually, which is related to this whole notion of multiple documents issued by different authorities to prove the same thing, right? And that's background checks, right? I deal with a lot of background check issues. Just kind of by accident, I fell into one of my niches, which is challenging FBI background checks. I did it just ancillary to my services as a citizenship and immigration lawyer, and I realized there's a real need for it, so that's picked up, and that's kind of one of my niches. And I realized in the course of this that people have a woefully deficient mental model of how their background check works. Okay, people, I feel comfortable saying 90 to 95% of people think that they have one set of facts. Okay, so let's say arrest, charge, conviction, possible post-conviction relief, such as expungement, etc. They have one set of facts, and their background check, quote unquote, reflects that. Okay, and that's it. It's so what their legal record is insular, and it's centralized. Okay, and it's monolithic. And that is not at all the way background checks work. Okay, background checks are messy, decentralized. And what I mean by that is this: whether and to what extent you have a criminal record or a conviction is a complicated question, actually.